Amen.
On Monday, I picked my daughter up from school. She has early release on Mondays while my son stays for sports. So on Monday about 1:30, I picked up my daughter from school and we drove straight into the mountains, eventually all the way up to Mount Mitchell. It was chilly and clear and it smelled clean, and there were only like 4 other people up there. First, we stopped at a waterfall before we went up to Mount Mitchell. And we sat there in the sun and dipped our toes into the cold water. And I told her about what had happened earlier that day in Nashville. At a school where some of you have sent your grandchildren. In a city where many of you have children or grandchildren or spent decades of your own lives. We even have one parishioner who moved to Nashville and still considers herself Trinitarian. She's probably watching right now. My husband has a friend of a friend in Nashville who lost his 9-year-old on Monday. Many of us have personal and professional connections to this one, and so it feels very real and very near. And so I wanted my kids near. I knew Rosie would hear about it, and I wanted her to hear about it from me first because, well, at least partly because last week in Durham, in her old school district, 5 teenagers were shot, and 2 of them died. Not in school, but just around the corner from it. So she and her friends were already shaken up. And we talked about what happened in Nashville, and I asked her how she was feeling. And she said, I feel angry. Old Testament scholar J. Clinton McCann writes, in the face of evil, the worst thing is not to express anger. It is to feel nothing. What must be felt is grief, rage, and outrage. In their absence, evil becomes an acceptable commonplace. To forget is to submit to evil. To remember is to resist. Gun violence has become an acceptable commonplace for us. After all, we've had 92 days in 2023, and we've had 131 mass shootings in 2023. That's too much death for us to mentally grasp hold of. It's too much to look at. It's too much to remember. Honestly, by Thursday, I had forgotten about Nashville. Crucifixion was an acceptable commonplace in Jesus' day. Aspects of Jesus' death are totally ordinary. The historian Josephus writes about mass crucifixions during the 1st century. And records that in the years right before Jesus was born, a Roman general crucified 2,000 Jews. For slaves and political activists and Jews, crucifixion was not an uncommon fate. It was one of the law and order tools of the empire. I imagine that Jesus died on a Friday, and by Monday, most people went back to work and had forgotten all about it. After all, they had to put dinner on the table and get the kids to soccer practice on time. And the fact of Jesus' death is so familiar to us that our perception of it has dulled. Every week we chant, we remember his death. And perhaps those words have become too familiar to us. We can't really hear them anymore. We do remember his death. We remember that in Jesus, God entered human flesh, healing us by joining God's divinity to our humanity. We remember that Jesus lived, was tempted in every way, yet without sin. We remember that the upside-down kingdom that he preached about was such a threat to the powers that be, to the existing order, that they killed him. But reading the Passion narrative all the way through out loud, using our own voices as we did this morning and as we'll do again on Good Friday, that practice invites us to remember it a little differently. not in some rote or abstract or theoretical way, but to put our bodies and our own breath into the story. To ask ourselves where we stand as Jesus stands before Pilate and before the crowds, as he's mocked and beaten and killed. To ask ourselves where we stand when the ground beneath our feet breaks in two at his death. Today we're asked to look at death and not to look away, the thing that feels impossible to do. But I believe that looking at Jesus' death helps us face the death in our own world. If we can learn to look at Jesus' death, to keep it before our eyes, perhaps we can also learn to look with clear eyes at the death in our own world. The deaths from gun violence, the species deaths, dozens of species going extinct every day at a rate 5,000 times the natural rate. The murder of LGBTQ people, the reality that transgender people are over 4 times more likely than cisgender people to be victims of violent crime, the rise in suicide and drug overdoses in our country. As we consider the scene of Jesus' death, as we learn to stay there for a while and to resist growing numb to it, to cultivate that right response of grief and rage and outrage at injustice, then the way we respond to death in our own world will change. When we spend time at the cross, we learn that hope isn't born from avoiding reality, but from facing it and even embracing the absurdity of hope. Hope is born when we realize, as James Cone says, that it makes no rational or even spiritual sense to say that hope came out of a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. That God can make a way out of no way in Jesus' cross is truly absurd to the intellect, yet profoundly real to those who have suffered. When we see that God shares our deepest suffering, we begin to know that the troubles of this world will not ultimately define us. We find, too, that what matters most there at the cross is not where we're standing, but where Christ stands. Christ stands in solidarity with all us sinners, with the oppressed and forgotten. The forces of sin and evil did their best to defeat him, but his offering up of his life was so powerful that the stones cried out and the dead left their graves. We have reason to hope that all this death all around us is not the end. I don't often wear cross jewelry. There is one cross I think I'd wear, though. A cross like the Right Reverend Jim Curry wears. If you don't know him, the Right Reverend Jim Curry was Bishop Suffragan of Connecticut when the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened. 26 deaths, most of them 6- and 7-year-olds. In 2014, he resigned as bishop to devote more of his time to an organization called Swords to Plowshares. Just last month, this organization gathered with a crowd in Guilford, Connecticut to watch as the former bishop lit the furnace of his portable blacksmith shop. It glowed orange and it hummed quietly as it got up to 2,000 degrees, hot enough to soften the metal of a tray of disassembled shotgun parts so they could be hammered against an anvil and remolded. He called a volunteer from the crowd, and a 9-year-old named Oliver came up to help him, and together they hammered an old metal shotgun barrel and then reshaped it into a trowel, a gardening tool. That trowel was donated to a community garden there in Connecticut, where the vegetables harvested are given to a food pantry. An instrument of death became an instrument of life. The cross Curry wears is made out of pieces of an AK-47. It was a gun that was used in Mozambique's civil war in the 1990s. When that war ended, artists collected the guns and repurposed them. They took the piston of the AK-47, the part that created that automatic action, and they took the sights, and they reshaped them into a cross, into our shape of hope. We're about to turn to the table and remember Christ's death and sacramentally join all of our lives to the crucified one. And may we find as we do so that there we are given strength to look upon the death that surrounds us, courage to resist the forces of evil and empire, and hope that new life will spring forth, even in the place of the skull. Amen.
Amen.